think it's doing. Okay, there we go. Great. I'd like to welcome. We have Gabby Hewitt. She's a content creator to the book, The New School Rules. And who would have thought? Yeah, I mean, a year ago when when we really talked about some of the strategies and those kinds of things, how relevant it would really be with what we're facing now, and just the fact that it really isn't. Business as usual. I mean, for schools and so forth, it's certainly been a challenge. So we're glad that Gabby's here, and we also have Molly Ashkoff from Nebraska. Molly is actually going to be serving as our president-elect for NAMTC moving forward. So congratulations there.
I don't think the vote is in on that yet, though.
No, but it's 99.9% sure. So. Congratulations there, and my name's Jeff Craven. For those that don't know me, I'm the executive director of NAMTC, and at that point, I'd like to turn it over to Molly and Gabby. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, I want to just welcome Gabby. We're excited to have her, and like Jeff said, she was a contributor to the book, The New School Rules. Great book, and like you said, very timely. Gabby comes with a lot of experience. She has, worked with small schools, large schools. She's been a teacher, she's been a coach. And so I just think we have so much that we can gather from her. I will let you fill in if there's more experience you want to talk about, but I know she's kind of prepared some stuff with how this pandemic and change has impacted us and what we can do. So I'll turn it over to Gabby, and then I will, like Jeff said, we'll watch for questions and things like that as we go.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Molly. Thank you, Jeff.
Uh-huh.
I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then I know the question always comes up, can we get these slides later, that kind of thing. Anything that I share, you're more than welcome to take and use in whatever way makes the most sense. You can turnkey them with your teams. You can reach out if you want to continue the conversation, but something that I will always sort of try and do is I'm going to talk to you about what we call responsive habits, but I'm also going to model sort of the way that we do that at our company, and then also share how it's grounded in sort of the current experience that we're having. So I am imagining that everybody who's on the call right now has been part of the book study on the new school rules, so there might be some background knowledge. Is that correct?
They've probably not necessarily,
okay.
Or they've had the book or are familiar with it. So
no worries.
We advertise it out to our whole membership. So there could be people
awesome.
that haven't.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. My CEO, Anthony Kim, is actually one of the co-authors of the book. And so I would say this is probably 2 years ago at this point, wrote a book called The New School Rules. And the book is divided into 6 guidelines really for creating more responsive organizations. The idea behind responsiveness being if you are responsive when changing conditions happen, your organization can sort of weather them. And we joke, but I know it's not it's not a very funny situation that we're in, but we have said over and over again that this is a real practical test for if these new school rules are actually, if they can move from theory to practice. So we have actually sort of refined our perspective on what responsiveness is in the age of COVID, and that's sort of what I wanted to share with you today. So I know there's a few different people on the call. I'm looking at the participant list, and we always start with something called a check-in, and it is a responsive practice. We define practices as things that you could practice over and over again until they become habits, but it's a responsive practice that we always recommend teams take back. Because if you want to get to a place where people feel psychologically safe to share ideas, which is a key component of a responsive organization, you have to practice people sharing ideas. And so one of the ways that we actually practice that is by having every single person check in. And so today we'll actually do that just using the chat feature. If you are able to, on my screen, it's just located in the bottom right, but you could, if you could just share your name. I know some of you are already checking in. I think Jeff had you check in. If you could just share something that you never thought you would do until quarantine, you can add it to the chat. And again, it's just a practice to get everybody feeling like they are contributing to the same space. It's a key component of responsive teams. I will model and I will share my check-in. I never thought I would make marshmallows from scratch, but my 2 little boys were craving s'mores and I Googled it and it's actually quite easy. So something I never thought I would do until quarantine. And I know Jeff and Molly are watching the chat, but we have someone saying weekly phone calls to check on students. Tina from East Syracuse saying, never thought I would have to teach from home. Diana, never thought my calendar would be so full. Diana, I never thought I would homeschool my grandchildren until quarantine. Absolutely. I never thought I'd be a preschool teacher. I taught middle and high school. Sarah, never thought I would run so many Zoom meetings. Yep. Danielle, never thought I would run outside. I love it. Awesome. We'll keep them coming. Again, I try and model the things that we ask you to do. And so one of the things is, you know, getting everybody to feel safe to share. That's, again, a key theme of a responsive organization. All right. So with that, I wanted to share a little bit about what I wanted to talk to you about this next hour. And I know Molly is going to make this more of a dialogue than I could with these slides. So if you have questions, just throw them in the chat and Molly can interrupt me at any time and sort of make sure that I'm answering those that come up. But what we've done sort of in the last 2 months is we've taken the rules from the book, The New School Rules, and we have said, if we think about responsive crisis management, these are what NSR rules sort of apply and help you get through each of those phases. And we've also recently, just last week, put out our perspective on what it's going to take to return post-COVID. And so I know this is probably top of mind for a lot of you who are on this call right now. And there are a lot of things out there that we have read around why returning is so important and what components are important, but nothing out there around how to do that. And so we're actually very proud that we've been able to take sort of this philosophy of being responsive and apply them to what it's going to look like when you return. And so I'll share a little bit about that as well with you. Okay. All right. So this is a quote that it comes straight from the book, The New School Rules, but it comes from this author of A Book for Leaders, Tom Northup. And he just says, organizations are perfectly designed to get the results that they're getting. That's true in times of crisis. That's true in times of traditional constraints. And so if there are different results you want to get, there's a different way of working, right? There's a lot of quotes out there that have sort of the same message. But when we think about responsiveness, it is really critical for organizations to be able to meet changing needs, especially when there's so much unknown information. And that's why we see this as sort of a key framing for what it means to be a responsive organization. And then just to sort of hammer the point home that times are changing, right? I don't know if there's any teachers on the call or people who work directly in a school building, but 6 weeks ago, really at this point, I think it's more like 8 or 9 weeks ago, our work might have looked like this, or our buildings might have looked like this, or our districts might have looked like this. And now I think it was Diana put something in the chat about never thought I'd run so many Zoom meetings. I think that was actually Sarah. And so it really sort of looks like this, but this is actually a stock photo of what working from home looks like. She looks very peaceful. She has a lot of natural light. She has 3 screens. This is actually sort of what my life looks like. And I'm very grateful this call is happening during nap time, so I can actually sit still. But this is our reality, right? And so we can't actually operate with the same rules given all of the changes that have happened. We no longer have the constraints of a traditional school day, a traditional master schedule, traditional in-person meetings. So we have to think about our work a little bit differently. And this is just this idea that responsiveness is more important now than ever, right? We want to recreate feelings and environments where people feel safe to share, safe to collaborate, where they don't get Zoom fatigue, where we're really using time purposefully. And we need to consider how we do that when we're working in more isolated ways. And so we see responsiveness as a key measure or a key lever for that. Okay, so I've been throwing around this word responsive a ton, and I just want to norm and define what it is. If you've read the book or if you haven't read the book, this is framing that comes from a few different books that informed the New School Rules, but not directly from the book itself. This is from a book called Brave New Work. And if you're really into this idea of responsive organizations, it's another one that I recommend. It's just around how do you respond in times of change, like a crisis might give you. And so I like this framing because it really talks about what it means to be a traditional organization versus a responsive organization. And the author of Brave New Work talks about this idea of the stoplight system, right? And so whatever organizations are trying to do, they're usually trying to meet a need or fulfill a mission. Education organizations are usually trying to fulfill the mission of student achievement for all, equity for all, that kind of thing. no matter what district you have in the country, they all have a very similar mission. And so the idea is you take a question or a need, you turn it into a problem of practice by using this language of how might we, and then you use that to generate solutions. But some of your solutions are sort of grounded in traditional constraints or practices, and some are grounded in more responsive constraints. So I'll give you an example here, right? Imagine you are the person who is building a city and you're building the layout and engineering sort of what the roads are going to look like. Your problem of practice might be, how might we prevent cars from hitting each other at an intersection while also maintaining the maximum flow of traffic, right? You don't want to put a stop sign on every corner. And so the two biggest solutions that we use in this country are the stoplight system and a roundabout. And a roundabout's very different than a traffic circle. I lived in DC for 12 years and traffic circles are not fun. And I've learned that roundabouts are very different. So I was like, okay, I can get on board with this. But the idea here is that these are both very viable solutions, but they operate with different assumptions in the background. So they both address this problem of practice of preventing cars from hitting each other. But again, they have different assumptions. So I'll show you what those are. If it's a traffic light system, one of the assumptions is that people have to be told what to do, right? A red light means something, a yellow light means something, a green light means something, and we have to tell people what to do when they're at that intersection. And so when it flashes red, everybody understands this is what that means. The second assumption is that problems have to be managed with rules and complex technology. And so if you look at some traffic lights, they might have a green arrow or a red arrow or a red sign, a red light. There's all these other rules that operate. If, you know, power goes out and it's flashing red or it's flashing yellow, that means something else. So there's a lot of rules that you have to learn when you're getting a driver's license to be able to understand this operating system of a traffic light. And then the third assumption is you have to plan for every possible scenario, right? I know I've seen stop signs that have the actual pedestrian bike sign, they have arrows, they have multicolored signals, all those things. And so this takes a lot of thinking, it takes a lot of work, it uses up a lot of your human capital to be able to put a system like this in place. If we were to equate this with return planning after COVID, when schools are reopening or going back to brick and mortar settings, and we were to operate like this, we would take a lot of time planning. We would have to plan for every possible scenario. We would have to come up with a ton of rules. We might have to, have task force that are there to communicate the rules. And then our stakeholders, our parents, our families, our teachers, they might be like, why wasn't my input, taken into consideration, right? I know as a driver, my input wasn't taken into consideration when stoplight traffic signals were put out. If we compare this to a roundabout though, there are very different assumptions, right? And so the first assumption is that people can be trusted and they're going to use their judgment to do the right thing, right? There's a traffic circle, it goes around and around and around, it's a roundabout. And then there's different merges or pathways to merge on, and there's different pathways to merge off. But we're assuming that if people know how to use a roundabout, that they can be trusted, they'll do the right thing. They'll yield when they have to yield, they'll merge when they have to merge. The second assumption is that problems can be managed with simple rules and agreements. There is literally just one rule for a roundabout, and the rule is of right of way, right? You know who has right of way. If you're in the circle, you have right of way. If you're out of the circle, you don't have right of way. That is the only rule you have to understand to be able to use a roundabout. And then the final assumption is that a lot of scenarios will occur, but these protocols or the simple rules are going to be sufficient enough to handle them. And so it's okay if traffic increases one day, people will still be able to operate with that rule. They're just going to operate at a different pace, right? And so these both work, right? The idea of a traffic signal, the idea of a roundabout, they both work when we're trying to solve this problem of how might we prevent cars from hitting each other. But you can see they have different assumptions, and they also have different data that points to the impact of each, right? So this actually blew my mind when I was looking at this. There are 311,000 traffic signals in the United States. I don't know if I thought it'd be more than that or less than that, but that is just an insane number to be thinking about. And there's only a little over 1,000 roundabouts in the United States. Now, again, that doesn't count traffic circles, but there's only about 1,000 that operate in this way. So there's a huge gap in the way that we see this. But if we look at the data, roundabouts reduce injury collisions by 75%, fatal collisions by 90%. There's an 89% reduction in delays. You're not going to have traffic jams at a roundabout. You're going to have a lot of traffic jams at traffic signals. They're a lot cheaper to maintain year after year. And on top of that, they work during power outages. So they work given a ton of external pressures or a ton of external conditions. And I would actually tweak this and say, not only do they work during power outages, they work in times of crisis, right? So they work now when there's so many different things happening. There's so much data out there. And the way that we operate as human beings, as professionals, as caregivers, it's totally different. A system like a roundabout would continue to work no matter what those external forces are. And so I just wanted to share that and sort of like end with this thought for this first part and see if there's any questions in the chat. But the reason why I wanted to start with this is because when we think about this idea of being responsive strategies address the challenge, as do traditional strategies. But they use way less manpower. They're fiscally more responsible. They are giving people a lot of ownership, and they're assuming that people can be given guardrails and protocols. And they work in times of crisis, or they work when information is changing. And so when we talk about operating in a responsive way, or when we talk about return planning in a responsive way, the analogy I would love to leave you with is just this idea of operating like a roundabout, right? How can we continue to have those assumptions of a roundabout that people can be trusted? We just need simple agreements. We need to move forward with this idea of what's safe enough to try instead of planning for every single contingency, because there's so much that's unknown out there. So would love to stop and see, I don't know, Molly, if there's any questions coming in or if you guys have any takeaways.
There isn't any questions in the chat box presently. Please still type them in there if there is. But I loved your analogy. It makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And I feel that there's just, we need to get to that responsive strategies rather than, like you said, trying to plan for everything. So great ideas.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, continue to think of that as like, how do we operate, like a roundabout? I think that's the big thing. That's a mantra that we've adopted at our company, is this idea of like operating like a roundabout. All of our work, I didn't really introduce our company too much, but we work with school districts across the country to implement just different things, right? Making classrooms more student-centered, blended learning, personalized learning, strategic planning, that kind of thing. So our work is very much based in physically flying and traveling and being with a district. And as you can imagine, COVID totally halted that in the same way that it halted education across the country. And so we were really very quickly able to pivot and sort of say, all right, if we're thinking like a roundabout, how do we pivot? And we continue to try and address our problem of practice, but we just do it in a different way, right? Awesome.
Miriam made the comment in the chat that the responsive approach strategy requires trust. And I was thinking that exact same thing. That was really hard coming into this because it was everybody working from home, and that's a whole new experience, and trust was a huge issue. And so I agree, Miriam.
Yeah, thank you for that. Awesome. Okay, so that's actually a really good segue, Miriam, into just sort of introducing the 6 rules from the book. And you can see rule number 2 around teaming is the idea of building trust and allowing authority to spread. If we don't trust drivers to make the right decision in a roundabout and to honor right of way, then the roundabout doesn't work, right? So I think that's a really good point to make. So these are the 6 rules that come from the book. We call it NSR for the new school rules, but it comes from this book around how do you create more thriving, responsive schools, districts, and organizations. And you can see a theme across all of them, right? And the theme is sort of what we call safe enough to try, and I'll explain that a little bit further on. But when you plan for change and not for perfection, if we just take that first rule, if you were to flip that and plan for perfection, then there is a good chance you are going to be the last district or the last school to sort of have your return plan out there ready to go. Because we can't make a perfect plan when there's so much unknown data out there right now. We know that there's probably going to be budget cuts that districts might have to endure. We don't know the extent of that impact, right? Or we don't know if there's other funding sources that can supplement that. And so by flipping that and thinking about this idea of planning for change, we're just putting in simple rules and agreements, just like a roundabout. And we know that we have to pivot as we go, but that overall direction is not going to change, right? We're going to have a change in strategy maybe, but not a change in that overall direction. The second rule around teaming is sort of exactly what Miriam, you were saying, this idea of building trust. If you can build trust, you can allow authority to spread, right? If you don't build trust, you're not able to do that second part, right? You're not able to allow authority to spread. And then the other thing I would say is if you are someone who's making a lot of decisions in your district or your school or for your team or your organization, you are probably feeling like you're at capacity. I think I saw that come in a lot of the check-in questions as well. And there might be other people on your team that have just untapped potential, and they're looking for more authority or more opportunities to have authority and make decisions. And so that building trust piece is really important for both parties, right? For you as a leader, to not feel like you're totally tapped out, especially if you're like me and you have competing priorities at home, or you have little ones at home, or you're caring for someone. And then it's also helpful for your team to have more buy-in in their work. The third rule is this idea around managing roles, and I'll sort of go through the rest really quickly. The first two are the most important. But the idea of managing roles is defining the work before you define the people, right? It's frequently easy to say, oh, I'm the assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction, so everything that remotely looks like curriculum and instruction falls on my plate. And that is a good way to burn someone out. I was a social studies teacher, and then I took on a role where I was in the curriculum and instruction office in my district. And I know I was making decisions on science. I was making decisions for early childhood learning where I had no experience with it. If we had actually, as a team, defined the type of work we needed to do and then plugged in the people that matched, it's just a different way of thinking about managing roles. Safe enough to try for decision making is sort of a concept that I shared a little bit before, but that's really the idea of operating as a roundabout. It is safe enough for us to say, here's one rule. We're going to assume the best. We're going to assume that people understand right away and they can make decisions with that simple rule or that simple agreement. And it doesn't delay our decisions, right? We're not waiting for everybody to get on the same page and have consensus. This is never going to happen, even on a team that I work on where everybody is totally bought into responsive practices. We still would never be able to come to an agreement on something. And so we use different protocols that help us identify what's safe enough to try. And when we say that, all we mean is I can't object to a decision or a proposal on the table just because I don't like it. I have to fit certain criteria that makes it unsafe to try. So this proposal will harm us or move us backwards, or it's going to prevent us from doing our traditional work, or it's going to have a detrimental impact on our stakeholders or our students or our families, that kind of thing. And so instead of that, we can just say, oh, this is safe enough to try. Let's try it. And if we fail, we just look at failure as data. And then the last two rules are just around this idea of communication and schools growing when people growing. So if we're able to share information, if we're able to learn from each other, then we're going to see an overall upward tick in sort of the growth of our organization. Okay. All right. So I just I wanted to name these because the second part of what I wanted to share with you was how we see the phases of responsive crisis management, which is essentially what we're in with COVID. And how these rules sort of fit into each phase. A good responsive leader will have these rules sort of in their tool belt at all phases, but there are some that you would lean on more. So I'm going to introduce the phases to you, and then I might stop and ask you to add to the chat where you feel like your team is, or your school or your district, depending on what role you have. So this is sort of the way we've defined education crisis management when we think about it in a responsive way. And this was us just like playing around it and saying like, maybe this is how long it takes. So the amount of time has no impact on where you should be right now. I think I'm still working with districts that are still feeling like they're in their short-term response phase, but this is just like a general sense. We did a lot of research around crisis management. I lived in New Orleans through Katrina, so I went back and looked at a lot of research, and there's a lot of overlap in any type of crisis management. And so we just sort of synthesized that and said that these are the 5 phases that any school district is going to go through when it comes to responding to COVID. So the first phase is this idea of sense making. And the thing that I love about this phase is it's really important to share information, because if you don't share information, someone else is, and it might not be the right information. Another way of saying it is if you don't make sense of the crisis, someone else is going to make sense of it. I saw districts who responded right away and they said, we're going to distribute devices. We're really not sure what's going to happen, but we are planning for a long-term closure at this point. We have no other information. And then I worked with other school districts that didn't get any information out because they just weren't sure. And so instead of saying, we're not sure what day we're going to close, we're just planning for a long-term closure, other people started saying, oh, I think school's going to be closed, or I think we're going to have spring break early, that kind of thing. So people are going to fill in gaps. It's important in the first phase of crisis management to make sense, even if that's just to say, we don't know. And I'll show you some examples of how we did that at our company. The next phase is around short-term response. And I know I saw this pretty consistently across districts, and this is something that sort of gave me great pride to be in education. But it's the idea that Maslow before Bloom's is the working philosophy, right? The idea of meeting those social emotional needs over trying to push academic achievement as the goal, being what's operationalized. And so the way this looked in schools and districts is, you know, people might have been doing meal delivery in the beginning. I know a lot of superintendents were saying, don't worry, teachers, about being online or getting packets together. We are just deploying our operations team to make sure that our kids are fed, to make sure that we're handing out Wi-Fi hotspots, to make sure that we're getting devices out. And so that's really what we would just term the short-term response is getting all the logistics out, or all the sort of like temporary infrastructure out, so that you can continue forward in your response. The third phase, which is where I think a lot of districts might still identify they are, is what we call the medium to long-term response. So this is where the working philosophy might feel like Maslow needs are met. You might feel like you already have a structure for handing out meals. You already have a way of distributing devices. And now it is okay to plan for continuity of learning, right? It's okay to say, all right, we're going to have teachers log on at this time. We're going to hand out packets. We're going to have regular check-ins with our students, and think more academically as opposed to just social emotionally. Return planning, I'm going to dive into a little bit later on in the call, but this is where schools and districts are focusing on actually returning to, and my husband hates this term because he thinks it's overused, but returning to the new normal, right? And so I know a lot of people are saying that the new normal is this, the new normal is that, but that is really what return planning is. It's not returning back to normal, because I think everybody would agree that that is just not possible, nor did normal work for every single student out there, right? There were already inequities that existed, and COVID just sort of shone a spotlight on it. And so the return phase is actually a really interesting, unique opportunity to return to something even better. And I know I mentioned earlier, I'm born and raised in New Orleans, and I saw this in New Orleans post-Katrina with the Recovery School District. If you look at anything that happened in New Orleans in the, in like 2006, 2007, 2008, you would see that we went from being 49th out of 50 states in the country for education to something that was much higher. We're not breaking top 10, right? We're not competing with California or New York right now, but we're certainly not almost last in the country anymore in terms of how Louisiana has sort of advocated or funded or created structures for education. And so I think that was a really good case study in thinking about what return planning looked like when you are reimagining what's possible. And then the last phase is really just sort of almost a retrospective phase where you're reflecting on, what were our successes, what were our learnings from that return or that reentry period, and how do we now standardize those? So it was really interesting to say, okay, when we return, we're going to do this. That worked so well for us. Let's add that to our standard operating procedures, and that becomes part of the new normal. All right. So if there are any questions, I'm not seeing any pop up, but I'll throw it over to Molly if any pop up, or you can interrupt me. Feel free to add them to the chat. What I would love to hear is if you guys feel like you can identify, this is where my team is right now. We are in the short-term response, or we're already thinking about return planning. Would love for you to throw that in the chat if that is something that you sort of already can identify for your team. Okay, I'm going to actually skip this because I think I sort of talked through this. Okay. While you are throwing that in the chat, if you would like to, I do want to sort of connect this and say, we started with talking about what responsiveness is. We started, and then we continued and we said, these are sort of the rules for being more responsive. I want to show you how we think about these fitting into each of the phases of crisis management. And I won't spend too much time on the earlier ones I know, Molly, you already shared that you're working on moving from long-term to return planning. And so I might actually spend a little bit more time here depending on what answers come through the chat. So sense making, sharing information is obviously very critical here. Information has to get out quickly. Smaller chunks are better than larger chunks. And again, I'll show you some examples of what that looks like in a little bit. And then the idea of aiming for safe enough to try, right? It is safe enough for us to share this information, because if we don't share something now, other people are going to plug in what and maybe spread some misinformation. So these are the two rules that we think are probably most important in the earliest phases of a crisis response. The next one, short-term response, we really think about this as planning for change. And so if you're just thinking not about continuity of learning, but you are thinking about how do I just like keep everybody level, then you're planning for change, not perfection, right? You're not thinking about what's my perfect master schedule for remote learning. You're just thinking, how do I even get people fed, and how do I make sure people have communication channels open, that kind of thing. For the medium to long-term phase, you'll see that teaming becomes really important here. And this brings us back to that idea of building trust. So especially if you're someone who is saying that you feel like you're in this right now, then you might feel like people are starting to disengage. Maybe students are getting really tired of the virtual learning. Educators are tired of the Zoom calls. And so we need to actually figure out ways to allow authority to spread so that the people who are actually on the front lines experiencing this have some decision-making power. This is also where you could think about the idea of defining what's next. And so what work needs to be done, and how do you plug in people to do that instead of the other way around? Instead of saying, oh, you're the assistant superintendent for operations, everything under operations falls under your belt. And then I think just looking in a couple of responses coming in, it looks like some of us are moving into the return phase. And so this is where I would argue thinking about this idea of aiming for safe enough to try, and thinking about the idea of planning for change, not perfection, become really, really important, right? And so I put in just a few tips here, right? Thinking about for your readiness for return planning or reentry as a sprint or as a cycle. And so if you're like, I don't need to have a perfect return plan for 2021, but I do need to figure out what back to school is going to look like, you can just make decisions based on that sprint or that phase of reentry. The same thing for planning for change. We use that language of a sprint cycle. A sprint is, the same analogy as you would get from a marathon. If you're running 13 miles, it's easy to think about all 13 miles at once. It's also a quick way to feel exhausted and to delay any decisions from being made. But if you just think about, I'm going to run this first mile, or I'm going to run to that lamppost, right? It helps you sort of get to moving faster, make decisions faster. And if you need to slow down, if you need to change your tempo, you can do that as new information comes in. So we use that analogy a lot when we think about planning for change. And then, of course, being a learning organization is the idea of using that sort of final phase of continued preparedness and reflecting on what worked, what was a success, what do we want to operationalize and add to our standard operating procedures at this point. Awesome. Cool. And then this is just sort of an overall view of how you can think about all the rules fitting in. So I want to pause again and just see if there are any thoughts or questions. Still want to encourage you to add them to the chat. I appreciate the ones that have been coming in so far, but if there's anything that you want me to highlight, I am more than happy to do that before I share really the final thing that I wanted to talk about, which is helpful for the return phase. And that's the idea of what's safe enough to try. Okay. All right, so keep them coming. And I'm going to expand on this because when I say this has been our mantra, I feel like if anybody at our company was going to get a tattoo, it would probably be this. We use this all the time, just like saying, oh, it's safe enough to try. It's safe enough to try. It's almost become just like the part of the culture of our organization. And I would say any responsive organization has a very similar mantra. So this is going to be the most helpful mantra or mindset for you to have when you start thinking about return planning. And so I just want to take a few minutes to share that with you before sort of wrapping up. Okay. So this is one of my favorite stats that came from the book, The New School Rules. I did not know this, but I could totally see this being a reality. Stanford researchers said, okay, like what are the things that people make decisions on? And I think this was actually inspired because there's a lot of famous leaders, Barack Obama, Vera Wang. I'm trying to think of some other names that came up that do not have like a sort of a palette for, or a rainbow of a wardrobe. They just have a palette and they say, I'm going to have like a black, a white, and a gray sort of palette for what I pick because I want to save my brain power for other decisions. I don't want to make decisions on what I'm going to wear. And so this all came in this study from Stanford Education Research Group. And they were talking about like, well, what are the decisions that people are making each day? And what does that mean for our decision-making ability? And so I did not know this, but apparently each day on any given day, you make 221 decisions about food alone. The reason why this number seems so high is that so many of them are habitual. We don't actually record them as a decision or an active decision that we're making. It's very much unconscious. So if you're a coffee drinker like I am, it could just be the decision to have coffee. You don't actively make that. You're not saying, okay, today I'm deciding to have coffee. It's typically a habit you have, right? You go and you turn on the coffee maker. You're not making the active decision to do it, but it is a decision that you've made. Or you're not deciding to add creamer or sugar or drink it black, right? Those are decisions that you just habitually make. In addition to that, there are 30,000 decisions that you make during a single day if we were to take every decision that's personal and professional and compress them into a 24-hour block. So decisions from you get a text message, are you going to respond? Are you going to log on to social media? Are you going to open that email? How are you going to respond to that email? All of these decisions just lead to what researchers call decision fatigue. And so if you think about the idea of safe enough to try, it is meant to alleviate some of that decision fatigue. Instead of saying, let's talk for an hour and get to consensus, that is where you're going to really feel that decision fatigue. And so it's easy to say, okay, is this safe enough to try? And what can we move forward with? And I just added that I don't know what that number is in a time of crisis, but I would argue that maybe it's like 100,000 decisions that you were making in those first few weeks post-COVID. So if you think about where you were in March, you probably felt like you were making so many decisions all at once. And so just having this operation of safe enough to try is really helpful. And so there are a couple of reasons why we say safe enough to try, as opposed to just like aiming for consensus. The first one is this idea of delayed decision making. And what I wanted to share here is just this idea that if you waste time not making a decision, it can have long-term effects. And I shared that a little bit earlier when I said, if you don't make sense of a crisis, someone else will make sense for you. And so we don't want to delay our decision making because by the time we make a decision, that decision might already have a half-life, right? The information might have already expired. There might be new information coming in, or someone else might have moved forward without you. I saw this in a district I was working with. They didn't put out a master schedule or any expectations for what at-home learning was going to look like. And so they had some teachers who just decided to start meeting with their class on a regular basis. And they had some teachers who decided to wait for sort of the authority to make that decision. And so there's some long-term effects of delayed decision making, which is why Safe Enough to Try is meant to help you avoid that pitfall. The second pitfall is really this idea of having a false promise of consensus. And so a lot of times we, if we're trying to make a decision, and I think this is probably what return task force are going to look like, we try and say, let's bring together all the smartest people in the district or the team or the people who can decide. We need a good cross section of the district. So maybe we want a parent representative, a student, a teacher, et cetera. And if we try and think that they are going to get to consensus, the reality is that's just not, it's a false promise. What is likely going to happen is you're going to have a few loud voices in the room and people are going to conform based on those loud voices. And so you don't actually have every single person's opinion, which is really what consensus is meant to be. Instead, you just have like a few loud voices that are making the decisions for you. And then really the last pitfall, if we don't operate with Safe Enough to Try, is this idea of defaulting to like a decider in chief, right? And so It's actually, this is probably out of the 3 pitfalls, maybe not the worst one to operate within. But the idea is like, I'm not going to make that decision. Jeff's going to make that decision. And if it fails, it's Jeff's fault. And if it's great, Jeff gets the glory, right? But that's a lot of pressure on Jeff. And he actually might not be the best person to make that decision. And so that's why operating with a safe enough to try mindset in a team setting is probably the best way to think about return planning. So wanted to share this quote, and I know I've been talking a ton, so I will be quiet while you are reading the quote. And then I just added a few questions that we ask ourselves to say, yes, this is a safe enough to try decision. So I love this quote, and I especially love the first 2 bullet points at the bottom. Is this good enough for now? And I think in a time of crisis, we actually do this inherently. We say like we have to get meals out, or we have to communicate to people. We don't actually wait too long. We don't operate with delayed decision making, which is really good. But we are forced to do that because it's a time of crisis. And so we have to say, yes, this is good enough for now. The other bullet point that I like is this idea of, is it safe enough that if it fails, we still have time to recover? And I think this is good because not everything needs to be a safe enough to try decision. If someone's personal well-being or safety is at risk, there's no room for failure, right? We don't want to mess that part up. And so if you're returning to school districts and there's a resurgence of COVID in the fall, like I hear might be predicted. That is personal well-being and safety. And so it might not be most helpful or most wise to think about safe enough to try, because you might not have time to recover, right? That's where you really do want to be precise in your decision-making. But for other things, like, can we try an A-day, B-day schedule? Can we try a hybrid model of virtual learning and at-home learning? Those are safe enough to try decisions if you still have time to recover. So just wanted to sort of name that. This is what it looked like at our company, just to show you the way we operated with Safe Enough to Try. In mid-March, we assembled what we just called a COVID-19 task force. Not the most creative name, but that's what we called it. And the idea was it was a cross-section of our company, someone from our marketing team, someone from our education team, someone from senior staff, et cetera. And these were sort of their accountabilities. They would meet regularly. Their job was to review new information and to make decisions for the team as a whole. They also operated with a safe enough to try mindset. And actually, I thought I had done that. Yeah, here you go. So here's an example of what our task force might have communicated out. So this is one of the members of our task force on our team. Her name's Shelby. And you can see a couple things. I just screenshotted some communication she sent out early on. And she said, like, our guidelines and policies have been updated. Specifically, we've added more guidance on business travel. I shared with you, we traveled a lot. Anything new is in blue. And then she also wrote, this document's a work in progress, but we feel like it's safe enough to try. It's very likely this will continue to develop throughout the week. And so on March 11th, we hadn't actually been grounded yet. We hadn't been restricted from travel. And so it was really important that she got that out, because if she hadn't, I think a lot of us would have said, do we get on this flight? Do we have to change our travel? And so by her sending this out, it actually helped us make decisions. And you can see how quickly information comes out when you're operating from a safe enough to try mindset. This is on March 12th. This is also in a time of crisis. So when you're doing this, when you return to school, you're not going to have, communication going out every day like this. But in the time of crisis, it made sense. And so again, just FYI, I've updated this. Again, new changes in blue, more details coming soon. In the meantime, post questions here. So again, not all the information is out there, but this is what it looks like to operate from a safe enough to try mindset. You're communicating out, you're acknowledging that there's still a lot of unknowns, but you're getting information out that people can use to make decisions. This is what it might look like in schools and districts. A COVID-19 task force might look like the superintendent and the assistant superintendent making decisions without consensus, but they might be considering feedback. And then they might actually let principals and teachers make decisions for their communities, right? They might say, you're the principal or you're the teacher, you know your students or your staff best, you make decisions. These are just the guardrails that we're operating within. That's very much a roundabout mindset, right? You make the decision. This is just the guardrail. There's right of way, right? That's the only guardrail that exists. Okay. So I'm just looking at time and I want to get us to this piece. The last thing that I wanted to share, I wanted to give you sort of a quick snippet of what it looks like to operate from a safe enough to try, because that is the mindset that is required to operate when it comes to this idea of return planning. And so when we think about a return to school post-COVID, we recently put out a research paper, and I'll link it at the end. It's a free document, so feel free to download or share or even give us feedback on it. But when we think about return planning, we think about three key phases that sort of exist in a sub-level of this phase. And so the first is actually scenario planning, right? Like determining what it's going to look like to return, knowing that there's probably a few different pathways. And I'm going to move forward just to show you what this looks like. So scenario one might be there's no physical distancing at all. We can just make a plan for what it looks like to return to school without that. Scenario two might be there's actually significant physical distancing that happens. And so we need to figure that out because maybe our buildings are not suited to serve all of our students or all of our staff if we have to have physical distancing. And maybe scenario three is we actually need to extend distance learning. There's probably a fourth and a fifth and a sixth scenario, but the idea is that you're thinking about what the options are when you're thinking about the paths forward. The second part of this is just reimagining. I mentioned this earlier with the Recovery School District in New Orleans, but this is a really unique opportunity to reimagine what teaching and learning are going to look like. We're never again going to have a reset button like this, or at least I'm hopeful we won't have another pandemic that shuts us down. And so this is a really good opportunity to sort of reimagine how do we fix the things that were present even pre-COVID. And then the last thing that we talk about is this idea of revamping. So how do we update our standard operating procedures and build in those agile and those responsive practices? Okay. So I'm going to pause there and leave us some time for questions. This is actually just the document that we put forward when it comes to designing a responsive return plan and I'm going to go back to this slide, that actually shows you the way that we think about returning post-COVID using those NSR rules and thinking like a roundabout. So I'm going to pause if there are any questions or comments, or if people want to come off mute. I don't know if you have the ability to do that.
I don't see anything coming in the chat yet, but I will say this is so wonderful and timely information. I was thinking, I hope I can relay this and some of these great thoughts when I work with my schools, because it's exceptional. So thank you.
Thank you.
We do have a couple. Can you post the link? Oh, you did.
Oh yeah, but I need to switch to all panelists and attendees. Sorry about that. Here you go. So that should be a direct link. It's going to ask you to put in your email. I'm sorry, but we won't spam you. So just put in your email and then it'll give you the PDF to download.
Any other thoughts or questions out there? Or Jeff, do you want to add anything?
I guess just a couple quick questions. Gabby, have you guys been working with any State Department of Educations or anything like that have been looking at returning? Because I mean, this type of information, I mean, it's just so paramount. I mean, and of course, in Pennsylvania, everything's pretty much, I don't know, sometimes it almost seems like the Wild West. I mean, there's just all kinds of and things being made.
Yeah, two things. On Pennsylvania, especially, I didn't share this with people, but I married a Yinzer guy, so I live in Pittsburgh now. So I'm very much Western PA. And a lot of our cases have been concentrated in Eastern PA, and it's very much divided the state. I think the state was divided before with the Steelers and Eagles rivalry, but it has, it sort of feels like Pennsylvania feels like two different states right now. And I imagine larger states like California even parts of New York. I work with a lot of rural districts in upstate New York, and I work with a ton of districts in the Hudson River Valley area. And if you've been following the news, Hudson Valley has, faced a lot of COVID exposure as well, whereas the rural areas are like, why do we need to shut down? We don't even have bus systems. The kids get themselves to school, right? So there's a lot of decision making, I think, comes down to this idea of like scenario planning. In terms of districts or state DOEs that we're working with, I'm working with Louisiana Department of Ed. We're working with Kansas Department of Ed. We're working with, we have a contact at the New York City, at the New York DOE that also is sort of working on a project with us in the Bronx. But in terms of like mass working with DOEs out there, we're just really trying to get this guide out there to support them in decision making, and then hopefully forge maybe a partnership that we can support with.
Yeah, it's very, as you mentioned, I mean, it's very challenging. I think it's all going to boil down to, because I know some of the initiatives we've been working with our regional healthcare, with the schools to print, 3D PPE stuff. That I think in a lot of cases it's really going to boil down to a regional basis where, they're going to have to, obviously there's going to be the overall guidelines from the state, but again, I think they're just going to be guidelines, and there's going to be that, some of the day-to-day decisions and, where do we go from here that are going to need to be made on that regional level.
Yeah, for sure.
And I agree, in Nebraska, we've got a very rural part of the state that has just not been affected like our larger cities, our eastern part of the state. And so it's not the same, and so even our, we have regional health departments, and if one of those has a meat packing plant in it, they're completely different than even from town to town within that region. So I think that I like the protocol thought. You had mentioned earlier, there's protocols, but then you just need to do some good decision making on your own. And I love the safe enough to try. That's empowering.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's sort of, I don't want to make light of it, but it has felt very life-changing to operate from that mindset. Like, if we have time to recover, let's just do it, because I am someone who likes to plan for perfection. So that's been a shift for me.
Are there any other questions for Gabrielle or Molly? I see one comment. Okay, go ahead, Molly.
I was just going to say they're agreeing, very encouraging by your advice. So
awesome, very cool.
Definitely very timely. What we will do, this is recorded, so we will have this archived copy will be available, under NAMTC and the website and so forth for this. I can tell you on my behalf personally. First of all, I want to thank Gabby, and Molly for facilitating this conversation. But I'm also planning to share this with my former ESA and hopefully try to. Try to get a movement going, like even with Harrisburg, with our Department of Education, because it's just, this is really the discussions and the decisions that need to be happening, and it's not only in education, but I mean, all over. I mean, the whole mechanism. I mean, it's just, it's very, 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 very timely and very well thought out. I want you to know that.
Yeah, no, we appreciate that. We're all, I could nerd out about what it means to be responsive all day. and so, yeah, anytime I can join the conversation, I will be the first person to talk about sort of the benefits of operating this way. It really does. It's the organizations that are going to thrive through a crisis, right? The organizations that stay sort of traditional are just not going to. And so it's definitely like sort of a means of survival at this point.
Okay.
There was one slide you had, and I just thought it was so reflective of where I work with 24 school districts, but some were waiting for the governor or the commissioner to make those decisions. And then, and then some were the very traditional, and then those were trying things. And pretty soon they're the leaders, and everyone's looking to them because they're willing to to try it and fail if need be, you know, or change and continue to grow. So it was very, I could just see I could just place my districts in that slide at those different places.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome.
Okay, if there are no further questions, again, thank you, Gabrielle and Molly, and we hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and looking forward to catching up with everybody hopefully soon. Actually be nice to see somebody in person soon, you know?
Any social interaction besides my 3 and 5-year-old, yeah.
Okay, well, everyone have a great day.
Well, stay safe. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Angela. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.